In Akamai's new State of the Internet Fraud and Abuse 2025 report, AI powered bots have exploded by hundreds of percent in a single year. They are scraping content at massive scale, corrupting analytics, and even threatening the basic business model for many web companies. For CISOs and digital leaders, this is no longer a niche bot problem. It is about revenues, customer trust, and compliance in a world where GenAI is now in the attacker's toolkit. To help us unpack what is really happening out there and how enterprises should respond, I am joined by Steve Winterfeld, advisory CISO at Akamai. Steve, it's great to have you back on the show.
Oh, I always enjoy these talks. I'm looking forward to today.
Me too. Steve, this report talks about digital fraud and abuse. When you use those terms, how do you draw the line between cyber fraud and abuse, and why does that distinction matter for how defenders respond?
So really it comes back to driving attack methodology. And so, as you look at this, fraud is about deception. And so when we talk about fraud, I default to something like social engineering. A classic example of where, stealing an identity, deception would be, account takeover, and that's, credential stuffing. I go out, I steal your username and password. I then just try it against a bunch of different banks. And if it works on one of the banks, because if you're like my dad who reuses passwords and has overly simple passwords, then your password for the grocery store gets you into his bank. And so that kind of a challenge is fraud. Now, abuse is, I put out a site for somebody, and rather than just using it as an individual, they query it hundreds of thousands of times and scrape all that data. Well, it's using that site in an unauthorized way. And so it's not necessarily illegal, but it is misuse. I'll give you an example here. So the publishing industry, if you put out a news article and AI goes out to search that, I ask AI a question, it goes out and asks 40 news sites and brings me back the answer. Well, those are zero-click searches, and that term means all those websites who sell advertising or sell membership or have revenue generation through people visiting them, they're all getting none of that. And so, right now, 63% of AI bot triggers are against publishing industry, and that's just, it's really impacting revenue. It's really impacting their marketing numbers and causing those kind of problems. The last thing I want to touch on is when we talk about Gen AI or large language models, I use those terms interchangeably. Here is one of the things we'll talk about is protecting them. And as a CISO, and you and I have talked about this before, I have three problems with Gen AI. The first is I need to protect my employees using them. Could be the marketing, putting out material before it should be released. Could be developers, putting out sensitive code in them. I have internal use where I'm buying capabilities that use it. And then I have external services. And those external services are going to be primarily what we talk about today. And a lot of this ties very closely to APIs, those machine interfaces. So now I've got a Gen AI facing publicly, and those APIs or bots are just causing huge scale. So those are some of the terms that we'll use as we go through our discussion today.
Perfect. Once again, thank you so much. Now, based on what you are seeing across Akamai's platform, what are the key, now we can use the term Gen AI, LLM-driven bot trends on the criminal side? What are attackers actually doing with AI bots today that they could not do at this scale a year or two ago? Because what AI does is, I mean, it suddenly opens the floodgate. Not only can make things more sophisticated, you won't even know the difference between the real person versus a bot actually, or you can it can scale to a level that an ordinary human cannot even match, or even automation cannot match. So talk about how things have changed.
So really, there's a couple things here. Again, a bot is just a collection of systems. Take something like Mirai. They go out and infect everybody's pick a smart device, your DVR, your refrigerator, all your smart devices, and use those as a mass attack platform. And so when I used to talk about bots, I talked about friends, frenemies, and enemies. You know, people I want to come and take my information because it increases my customer base. If I'm a travel service and other travel services are scraping my prices, that's more a frenemy. And then enemies are sites like Worm GPT or Fraud GPT, which is fraud as a service. And those are real LLMs that criminals have out there. And so now that I talk about AI, it's more about what the bots are doing. So some of the bots are training. They're just scraping that data to be smarter and have better answers. Some are agents and an agent has a mission. It could be a shopping agent, it could be an agent that does some function. And then the last are just general searches, what we said before, go find me a toothbrush at this price. And so, as we talk about that, there's a lot of volume out there. There's a lot. And so going back to what I care about, I need to have visibility about what kind of bots these AI bots are doing. And so as we talk about this, all this sounds really hard, but AI is changing that. It used to be if you didn't know what you were doing, if you weren't a programmer, if you weren't an engineer, you just had to wait for somebody to make you a tool. So if you go out there and look at vibe coding, vibe coding is making this very easy for people to write code that do very simple things really quickly. So we're lowering the bar for people to get into this. It used to lower the bar because you could go buy fraud as a service. Now we're lowering the bar for you, the new cyber criminal, to go do it yourself. As we looked at the amount of traffic out there, the traffic has risen by 3,000% in the last year. As a CISO, some of that is legitimate, but all of that is a cost. And so now I need to start managing my cost and trying to prevent some of these from coming in that I don't want to come in. We've seen AI fraud is likely to exceed more than $50 billion globally this year. And I think we're in the early stages of seeing what can be done. Most of the cyber criminal activity we've seen is more conceptual than in the wild, but I think that's going to be coming more and quite honestly faster. And finally, I'm going to dip into the technical side a little bit. I talked about blocking all these and managing this, but a lot of these bots violate the directives I've set out on my website. And so they're ignoring the robot.txt file. They're using things like headless browser, and I won't get into it in our talk. Please, again, go grab the State of the Internet report, the SOTI Fraud and Abuse report for 2025, and the technical details are in there. But those are just some of the big trends we're seeing.
This report also breaks things down by industry. Uh, what you talked about it is already scary, but can you walk us through which sectors are getting hit hardest by AI bot traffic, and what that looks like in practice for areas like publishing, commerce, or even more sensitive industries like healthcare or financials?
Yeah, we talked a little bit about publishing, and they're really trying to figure out, is their revenue model sustainable? What do they need to do to react to this new environment? Commerce is right behind them. In fact, I'd say, there are more than 25 million bot requests during a 2-month observation period that we saw here at Akamai. And that is because, again, commerce is leaning into this early. Just like with APIs, commerce was one of the first to implement and most hit because they're moving their value. They're moving revenue generating capabilities into large language models. And so now that I'm interacting with the commerce site's GenAI instance, the criminal's right behind me doing that same thing, trying to monetize that. And so I think they're one of the hardest hit. Right behind them, more than 90% of the AI bot triggers in healthcare are attributed to scraping activities. And a lot of these are from search and training bots, not so much active fraud, but a lot of that reconnaissance out there. And so I want to be careful when I say healthcare. I say healthcare, and most of us think, oh, hospitals, but it's pharmacy, it's medical devices, it's healthcare insurance. So, I mean, this is an entire, I should say, healthcare sector to be better, you know, more inclusive. And so as you look across all of that, it's actually, stealing healthcare information on the insurance side is one of the more profitable areas for cyber criminals. So all of this is very critical. And you just, they're not hit as much because the sector isn't as big as commerce, but they're almost hit more on that scraping side. FinServe, again, more than 80% of AI bots in the financial services are training and search bots, but a lot of that scraping activity, competitive scraping, looking for opportunities to do other kind of fraud. And so all of this is every industry we're seeing is fairly heavily impacted. And then I won't talk about it here, but don't forget that if you download the report, if you're interested in different regional insights, we have a lot of the different regional breakouts as well.
Since we are talking about some of these critical industries like healthcare, regulated industries, how should companies in these specific, these are very, very sensitive industry, and you also gave example when we call our healthcare, it's not just those records. um, how should they approach gen AI challenges so that they stay compliant on privacy and AI side, but are also able to innovate and defend effectively against fraud and abuse? So it's like balance, to be compliant, to be able to protect themselves, at the same time being able to move faster, not like, hey, no, we are shutting all the doors, we are not touching AI at all. That is not going to happen.
Yeah, I think it's a fool's errand to try to say we're just not going to use it. Um, I truly do. We'll often see some heavily regulated industries a little slower to implement. Um, you know, Commerce is regulated for credit cards, but other than that, they're probably less regulated than some of these. And so what we see is, first of all, this principle. If you're trying to put compliance around this at a high level, what is your goal? And you want safe, transparent, fair, and accountable systems. So you see that through a lot of this regulation. And the second half of this is it's based on impact. If I'm buying a toothbrush, and I keep talking about that because I just read an article that used that example. So you're just going to get a lot of toothbrush examples today, unfortunately. But if I'm buying a toothbrush, the impact on me isn't very high. If I'm applying for a mortgage, if I'm applying for a credit card, then the impact is very high. And so based on the impact, then I'm going to be held more accountable. And that's simply where it's going. And a lot of that is, you know, coming out in these regulations. So the first regulations, again, Europe is almost always a leader in this area. The first thing we saw was the European Union's AI Act. Here in America, the National Institutes of Standard and Technology has an AI documentation. Both of these are good places to go plagiarize to make your own policies, to think about your own framework. I'm a big fan of using those things. Colorado, where I live, is one of the first states to implement a state law. So just like you saw with privacy, you saw a number of states implement privacy laws since we didn't have a federal privacy law. We're seeing that same thing start with AI laws. So if you want to see an example of what's happening in the United States, you can, look for some general articles on Colorado and their attempt to implement this. And it is very hard to implement this in a way that makes sense. So what we recommended in this report was kind of a program approach. So first thing you want to do is you want to establish coordination. Your legal and compliance teams, your risk management council if you're a large company, your cybersecurity teams, your vendor management team, and your IT team. It is a team sport. You need to coordinate across all of those to make sure you're doing things correctly. You need that tiered assessment. Going back to impacts we talked about, stuff that has high impact that we might be in a lawsuit, class action lawsuit for, that's what we want to pay attention to. You want model transparency. So data lineage maps, validation and testing reports. Again, the AI Act and the NIST have documentation around this, but ultimately I need to be able to do an audit. I need to do a cyber investigation. And if I didn't build that in up front, you're not going to be able to do that. So you need to design those capabilities with your large language model. Adopt a privacy preserving capability. So hashing, tokenization, encryption, those basic principles of privacy, along with access control and all those basic principles, we still need to implement those as we implement large language models. You can't protect what you don't know about. So continuous monitoring and some kind of a feedback loop to validate that. And finally, cross-functional oversight. We talked about that team up front. It needs to be, if you're in a larger organization, a little bit more formal so you can actually show what you did from an oversight. Does all that make sense?
It does make sense, and what I love, one of the highlights of our discussion is not just what is going on, but the phase where you actually tell as a CISO yourself what organizations should do. So, and of course, we will be linking to that report as well. Let's now talk about mitigation a bit. When a CISO reads this SOTI report, listens to this discussion, and wants to actually take action, what concrete steps do you recommend? Now it depends, every industry is different, but there are some fundamental things when it comes to security one should do. How should they think about controls like bot management, API security? And the interesting thing is that actually Akamai offers a lot of solutions, so they don't actually have to go and find them. And more importantly, AI specific safeguards to reduce fraud and abuse risk. You earlier also mentioned how to work with your team, what how this work, but it's less about, oh, they should do that, but versus have a process in place, very concrete process that can evolve over time as well.
Yeah, and it's funny as a CISO, you talk about people, processes, and technology, and our industry tends to be very poor at processes, which is why we have a lot of heroes. That one guy that can do everything, but that's also a choke point. A single point of failure. So I really think that is important. And I will emphasize that, all the data I talk about here comes from us protecting customers. When I give the stats on protecting large language models, it's from our experience with our AI firewall. When I talk about the API stats, it's our protecting APIs. And so absolutely, these best practices are going to be a reflection of what we see our customers doing to be successful. So one of the things, if you have a fraud problem, how do you focus on just that fraud problem? And so we took a section of the report and we went back to those industry best practices. And we think the best one is the OWASP, kind of the web page group. And they put out years ago the top 10 threats for web pages. And then APIs became popular, and they were different attack vectors, different attack techniques. And they needed different tools to protect them because suddenly you had things like business logic abuse. And that was a very different kind of attack. And so then, we had the top 10 for APIs. And then large language models came out, and within like a year, it already had updated because it's such a fast moving. So there's a top 10 for large language models. And what we did is we looked across all of these and we said, which one of these apply to fraud? Not just general crime, but to fraud specifically. And so within that, we said, access control, authentication, preventing injection attacks. Those are probably the top ones for stopping fraud. And so, then that maps down to the specific attack techniques: prompt injection, SQL injection, server-side request forgery, business logic abuse, configuration and plugin integration, protected data, healthcare, credit card, finance, and it's a much longer list. But you can kind of see if you map those kind of functions, then you can go back to your IT and your developer teams and your security controls, and you can say, let's focus let's focus our developers on preventing injection attacks. If we just do that for the next quarter, we're going to reduce our fraud. Let's make sure if we can only tune and update, some of our tools, because we're always behind the power curve. Let's focus on the tools that prevent fraud. And so this is just a way to think about, hey, again, I was a CISO for Nordstrom Bank, ran a lot of Nordstrom's infrastructure. Coming up right now, I really miss the Nordstrom discount I used to have, but that aside, they might want to focus on just fraud. And so that's a way where we've enabled that thought process. Overall, as I think about this, we talked about it before, blocking's not going to work. What does work is visibility, situational awareness, and then management. And so the first thing, is deploy AI-specific security controls. The controls that are designed for large language models. The next is right behind it, APIs are what are interacting with that. DDoS is not on the top 10 for OWASP. DDoS is another protection. So those are the two things, make sure those controls are out there, well configured, managed. You have visibility on them. And then start asking yourself question, can I see scraping? If I can't see scraping, and it's probably happening, then if I can't see, things like account takeover attempts, then I probably want to go in and figure out what's going on with my visibility. Because if I can't see those examples, that's a prime use case, then I'm not sure I trust those controls. Next, moving out of the tactical into more, the programmatic, the strategic, how can I work with my board to have a risk-based bot management approach? What is their risk appetite? What is my goal? Am I okay with frenemies? Am I okay with having some friction that my customers would experience to reduce fraud, reduce scraping, reduce my over cyber crime impact costs? So that's a huge part of making sure I'm on the same page with my leadership. And then finally, go back and use those external capabilities, those frameworks, and leverage those as a way to build your program quickly and be able to say to both your leadership and, worst case, if you're in some kind of a class action or lawsuit or an audit finding, you can go back and say why you made your decision and that, in fact, you did use best practices.
The next question is a bit tricky one because if you look at the state of AI bots today, and if you look at next 12 months, I don't want to go 24 months because that is not, even realistic. How do you expect AI-driven fraud and abuse to evolve, looking at the patterns that we are seeing based on the report that you folks have been doing? And what should CISOs start doing now? Because yes, this is a catch and mouse. Security in general is cat and mouse game. Security, as you and I discussed, is not a product, it's a process. You have to be right 101% time. Bad guys have to be right only one time, so that they are not caught off guard as both attackers and defenders get more sophisticated and they get caught between this whole Gen AI warfare.
Yeah, I'm going to start with what I need to do on my staffing side. So the first is, and I use example all the time. Uh, we have to give our people large language model skills. And so years ago, I had a security engineer go tell a developer who was doing, DevOps, and he said, well, you have to do file integrity management. You have to deploy this agent on your capability, your server. It's like, I don't have a server. I have these these scripts, these code, you know, snippets that are up in a container in the cloud. And it's like, yeah, but you got to put file integrity management on it. And it was like, okay, they're not talking the same language. And so we need to give our people skills around large language models so they understand how to work with these and protect them and investigate them and audit them. The second half is, what am I expecting from the criminals? I see more and more end-to-end attack campaigns. Right now, I think they're leveraging AI. I think what I see in the future is AI managed campaigns where they're using AI to develop the code. They're then using AI to develop code deployment. They're then using AI to do, actions after they get inside. And so at some point, we're going to see speed and scale change because everything's going to be under that one code or that one Gen AI implementation where it's going constantly and it's innovating and it's adapting real time. And I think that's when the fight's gonna change a little bit for us.
Steve, thank you so much for joining me and walking us through the findings from Akamai's latest State of the Internet Fraud and Abuse report. After listening to it, it's quite clear that AI-driven bots are no longer just a technical nuance. They are reshaping fraud, compliance, and sometimes I feel that they are actually challenging the business model itself, not the company, but the model itself for digital companies. So, which is even more challenging. But I really appreciate your time today. Thank you, and I look forward to chat with you again.
Thank you. I hope you guys out there can download the report. There's a lot of great information in there. I would encourage you to go to Akamai blogs and look at some of the latest blogs we've put out there. I'm always impressed by what our researchers are publishing. Thanks.